grave that opened by itself. Chapter 1. Whispers Beneath the Soil. It was the kind of silence that made the skin crawl, a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to stretch across the old Willow Cemetery like a shroud. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves as 13-year-old Mason tiptoed along the edge of the fence, clutching his flashlight with trembling fingers. He wasn't supposed to be there. No one was, not since the night the grave had opened on its own. Mason had heard it. Faint whispers floating up from beneath the ground, like a distant voice calling out from the soil itself. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but the sound returned every night, a low murmur, almost like someone trying to speak through dirt and death, and it always came from the same grave. Number 17. Curiosity mixed with a strange pull he couldn't explain brought him back here, night after night. He'd tried to tell his mom, but she dismissed it as nightmares. His older brother laughed. Even his best friend grew distant when Mason insisted the grave was whispering. Tonight, he had a plan. He was going to record it. He crouched beside the moss-covered stone and placed a small recorder near the cracked soil. As the wind died down, the whispers began again. Soft, mournful, pleading. Mason's breath caught in his throat. This time, he heard a name. Eliza. Suddenly, the ground beneath his knees shifted ever so slightly, and Mason's heart pounded in his chest. He scrambled back, the flashlight flickering in his grip. The soil moved again, barely noticeable but undeniable. He wasn't imagining things. The grave was alive, and it wanted to be heard. Chapter 2. The Day the Earth Moved. The next morning, the town of Elmridge buzzed with quiet unease. It had started with a strange vibration, barely strong enough to register as an earthquake, but enough to make coffee mugs rattle on kitchen counters and picture frames tilt ever so slightly on the walls. It lasted only a few seconds, but it left a residue of dread behind, like a whisper no one could quite catch. At Willow Middle School, Mason sat in homeroom, distracted and pale. His recorder was in his backpack, still untouched. He hadn't dared play it yet. The memory of the whisper, Eliza's name, echoed in his head, looping endlessly. He couldn't shake the feeling that saying the name out loud might During lunch, Mason slipped away from the noisy cafeteria and into the empty band room. With trembling hands, he pulled out the recorder and pressed play. For a moment there was only static. Then came the whisper, Eliza. But this time there was more. A rustling sound, a low thud, like something hitting wood, and then a faint moan. He dropped the recorder in shock, heart hammering. Someone, or something, was buried alive. That afternoon, news spread through the town that grave No. 17 had sunk in again. Groundskeeper Willis was overheard telling the church janitor that the earth had split open like a mouth. When Mason overheard this while walking past the chapel, his blood ran cold. He needed help, but who would believe him? After school, Mason biked straight to the library. He needed answers about the grave, about Eliza. What he found instead chilled him to the core. A yellowed newspaper clipping from 1962, buried deep in the archives. Eliza Blackwood, 17, dies in house fire, buried at Willow Cemetery. Mason stared at the black and white photo. The girl's face was soft, kind, but her eyes held something haunted. He didn't know why, but he could feel it in his bones. Eliza wasn't at peace, and now something was waking her up. Chapter 3. Midnight at Willow Cemetery. The wind howled through the rusted iron gates of Willow Cemetery as Mason returned that night, his breath forming pale clouds in the moonlit air. He wasn't alone this time. His friend Jonah had finally agreed to come along, mostly out of boredom and a desire to prove Mason wrong. But even Jonah looked uneasy as the graveyard loomed before them like a sleeping beast. "Are you sure it's this grave?" Jonah asked, clutching his phone tightly, the flashlight app barely cutting through the thick mist that clung to the ground. Mason nodded and pointed toward the older section, where grave No. 17 waited in the shadows. "You'll hear it, just listen." They crouched beside the grave, silent. For a few minutes there was only the wind. Then, soft and unmistakable, the whisper returned. "Eliza?" Jonah's eyes widened. Did you hear that?" Mason nodded, but didn't speak. His heart was pounding. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small notebook. He had begun recording the times, dates, and conditions of each whisper. So far, they only came after midnight, only at this grave, and always started with Eliza's name. Suddenly, a low creaking noise filled the air, like hinges turning after decades of rust. The boys turned toward the cemetery's chapel. Its heavy wooden door had opened a crack on its own. "Let's go," Jonah whispered. But Mason was already walking toward it, drawn by something he couldn't explain. He pushed the chapel door open and stepped inside. Dust danced in the moonlight pouring through the stained glass windows. The pews were crooked, some broken, and the altar was cracked. And then he saw it, an old wooden box resting on the pulpit. It looked like a time-worn offering chest. Carved into its surface was a single name: Eliza. He opened it. Inside was a charred locket, a scorched photograph of a family, and a brittle letter folded carefully. Mason pulled the letter out, hands shaking. The paper crackled as he opened it. "If anyone finds this, she is not at rest. She never was. Her soul lingers where the fire took her, and the fire never left." Behind him, a pew creaked. Jonah was still by the door, frozen, staring past Mason. "Mason," he whispered, "there's someone standing behind you." Chapter 4. The Boy Who Heard Scratching. The next few nights, Mason didn't return to the cemetery. Something about what Jonah saw, what he felt behind him, had shaken them both. But even as he stayed home, the unease followed Mason like a shadow. He couldn't sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard it again, the whisper, the moan, the sound of wood creaking beneath layers of soil. He thought it was in his head, until the sound began to bleed into his waking hours. One evening, Mason sat alone in his room, the recorder still clutched in his hand, volume turned all the way up. He had replayed the clip from the chapel again and again, trying to make out the faint noises behind Eliza's name. Then he heard something new, barely audible but distinct. It was slow, desperate, like fingernails against wood. The sound didn't stop when he turned off the recorder. It was in his walls now, or beneath the floorboards, or maybe beneath the ground. His mother knocked on the door. "Mason, are you okay?" He hesitated. "Yeah, just doing homework." But he wasn't. He was pulling out the notebook again, flipping to a blank page. He wrote, "Scratching heard outside, recording possibly in room." Then he stopped. The scratching had changed. It wasn't distant anymore. It was under his bed. Mason froze. He dropped to the floor and slowly lifted the sheet. Nothing, just dust and shoes and a piece of paper. That hadn't been there before. He reached for it and unfolded it slowly. It was old, yellowed, and smelled faintly of smoke. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "They left me there. I called and called. No one came. The fire came first." Mason stared at the note, heart thudding in his chest. His ears were ringing. And then the scratching returned. But now it came from the window. He turned slowly, and in the reflection of the glass he saw a figure standing in the yard, pale, still, watching. It was Eliza. Chapter 5, Grave No. 17. The next morning, Mason woke up with one thought in his head. He had to return to Grave No. 17. No matter how terrifying the last few nights had been, something was urging him to go back. Not out of curiosity this time, but obligation. A feeling had settled deep in his chest, like he was being pulled toward something unfinished. He didn't tell Jonah. Not after what happened at the chapel. Jonah hadn't spoken much since then and avoided the topic entirely. Mason knew he had to do this alone. The cemetery was quiet when he arrived. The usual rustling of leaves and distant crow calls were absent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Grave No. 17 stood out like a wound in the earth. The soil was sunken, cracked in places, as if it had been disturbed recently, not by weather or animals, but from within. He crouched by the grave and gently brushed away some of the loose dirt around the edges. The ground felt softer here, almost like sand. With each handful he cleared, a strange sensation grew in his fingertips. Warmth, and then cold, like touching something alive and dead at once. Then he saw it, just below the surface, a splintered corner of what looked like an old wooden coffin. Mason's breath caught. He leaned closer, brushing more soil away until a full section of the coffin lid was visible. It was covered in dark scorch marks, as if it had been burned long ago. His fingers trembled as he traced the edge of the wood, and then he noticed it. Scratches. Dozens of them. Desperate, chaotic. They hadn't been made by insects or decay. They were human. She had tried to get out. Before he could pull back, the coffin shifted. He stumbled away, heart pounding, but didn't run. He stared at the grave as the earth trembled ever so slightly, and then, like someone taking a shallow breath, a crack formed in the wood. Not large, but enough. A single burnt fingertip pushed through. Mason turned and ran, but not out of fear alone. He understood something now. Eliza hadn't died peacefully. She had been buried alive. The whispers, the scratching, the shifting earth. It was all her trying to tell someone. She wanted out, and Mason had just answered her call. Chapter 6. The Note in the Coffin. Mason didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the burned coffin lid and that single blackened fingertip pressing up through the cracked wood. He could still feel the soil under his nails, the cold breath of the cemetery brushing his skin. Morning came slowly, but Mason didn't feel any safer with the sun. His dreams had followed him into the waking world. Vague flashes of Eliza's eyes, a fire, screams muffled by earth. He needed answers, and he knew where to find them. That afternoon, Mason returned to the library. He was done searching for clippings. This time he dug into town records. He found blueprints for the cemetery chapel, burial logs, and eventually an old maintenance report mentioning something odd. The coffin for Eliza Blackwood had been replaced just days before the burial due to fire damage. Mason's pulse quickened. He flipped to the next page. A burial note was attached, signed by a Reverend Tully. At the bottom was a single line, hastily scrawled in ink nearly faded away. Place the letter with her. She must carry her confession into death. A confession. That word stuck in Mason's mind. He remembered the letter he found in the chapel box, the one written in trembling handwriting. Could it be Eliza's? Or someone else's trying to explain what really happened? He made up his mind. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Mason returned to grave No. 17 with a shovel. His hands trembled, but he didn't stop. The first few inches were easy, soft soil just like before, but as he dug deeper, the resistance grew. Roots clawed at him, and every crunch of wood or shift of dirt made his stomach lurch. Then the shovel hit something solid. Mason dropped to his knees and cleared the rest by hand until the blackened coffin lid was fully exposed. He didn't want to open it, but he had to. He pried the lid open with the handle of the shovel, heart hammering. Inside, the air was thick with ash and decay, but lying atop Eliza's folded arms was the letter. A different one. With trembling fingers, he lifted it out. This letter wasn't a confession. It was a plea. They said it was my fault. They locked me inside, but I didn't start the fire. Please, if someone finds this, tell the truth. Don't let them bury the lie with me. Mason stared down at Eliza's lifeless face, her expression still twisted in fear and agony. This wasn't a ghost story. It was a cover-up, and someone had gone to great lengths to keep it buried. But now the truth had claws, and it was coming for the surface. Chapter 7. Voices that shouldn't exist. The following night, Mason tried to stay away. He locked his door, turned up the volume on the TV, and tried to drown the thoughts out. But nothing helped. The whispering returned, not from the grave, not from his recorder, but from his own room. The voices crept in like fog, seeping through the cracks in his walls and floorboards. He didn't recognize them at first. They came in waves, young, old, male, female, all whispering fragments of sentences, looping, overlapping, some pleading, others accusing. Mason covered his ears and squeezed his eyes shut, but one voice pierced through them all. Eliza didn't do it. He shot up in bed, heart racing. That voice was clear, real, like someone had spoken right next to his ear. He turned on his light, trembling. The room was empty, but the air felt thick, heavy. He grabbed his notebook and scribbled down everything he could remember, fragments, names, phrases. Then he heard it again, this time from inside his closet. He approached slowly, every step louder in the silence. When he opened the door, nothing was there except a photo, an old, curled photograph pinned to the back wall with a rusted nail. It showed 5 people standing in front of a church. Eliza was in the center. Beside her, a man in a clerical collar, Reverend Tully. Behind them, the old chapel. Mason flipped the photo over. In faded ink, someone had written, "The ones who knew the truth." As he stared, the whispers returned, but now they were coming from his recorder, even though it wasn't turned on. He picked it up, pressed play. Static. Then a voice. Eliza's voice. "I didn't start the fire. He locked me in. He said I was cursed." Mason nearly dropped it. The stories in the town had always claimed the fire was accidental, but this was something else. Someone had silenced Eliza. Someone powerful. And now the voices were coming back, not just to haunt, but to reveal what had been buried with her. Mason realized he was in deeper than he ever imagined. And he was no longer alone. Chapter 8. The Forgotten Burial. The next day, Mason found himself staring at the photograph again, the one from the back of his closet. Eliza, Reverend Tully, and 3 others stood in front of the chapel, but their faces were blurred by time. He needed to know who they were. If these were the people who knew the truth, maybe they were also the ones who helped bury it. Back at the library, he requested old church rosters and funeral ledgers. Buried in a dusty file marked 1962, he found something strange. Eliza's name wasn't listed in the original burial records. In fact, her grave had been added 2 weeks after her death. Mason's fingers tightened around the page. It wasn't just forgotten, it was erased. More troubling still, there had originally been another name listed beside hers, another coffin scheduled to be placed in grave No. 17. The name had been blacked out with thick ink. Mason scanned the microfilm, hoping to recover something. One article mentioned a second body that had been found in the house fire, an unnamed servant girl. But there was no follow-up, no funeral notice, no burial record. Nothing. He left the library with a sinking feeling in his gut. Eliza hadn't been the only one buried. And maybe, just maybe, grave No. 17 wasn't meant for her at all. That night, as Mason lay in bed with the photo by his side, he heard a new sound, a distant humming, a lullaby. He sat up, wide-eyed. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from under the floor. Mason grabbed his flashlight and crawled to the loose floorboard he'd always ignored. With slow, shaking hands, he pried it open. Dust exploded into the air, but beneath the board was a small cavity. A child's doll, scorched and eyeless, lay there beside a burned hair ribbon and a folded scrap of paper. The paper read, "They only buried her because she was seen. But the other was never meant to be found." Mason backed away slowly. The burial had been forgotten on purpose, and someone was making sure it stayed that way. Chapter 9. Digging Up the Past. The next morning, Mason sat at the breakfast table, staring at his untouched cereal. The doll, the burned ribbon, the note, all of it felt too real to ignore. His mom was speaking to him, something about cleaning his room and getting ready for school, but her voice barely registered. He was somewhere else. He was still in 1962. After school, Mason went back to the cemetery, this time with more than a shovel. He brought gloves, a flashlight, and a small crowbar. He wasn't going to dig up Eliza's grave again. He was going to the far corner of the cemetery, where the oldest unmarked graves were hidden under thick ivy and moss. He had a theory. If a second girl had died in that fire, and she was never meant to be found, her grave wouldn't be marked. It would be hidden, erased. He wandered for nearly an hour, scanning the uneven ground for anything unusual. Finally, he spotted it, a square of sunken earth beneath an ancient oak tree. No marker, no flowers, just the faint outline of disturbed soil. Mason knelt down and ran his fingers through the moss and dirt. It felt different, softer, like it had been filled in not too long ago. He started to dig, more carefully this time. Only a few inches down, he hit something unexpected. Wood. But it wasn't a coffin, it was a box. Flat, rectangular, and sealed with rusted nails. He pried it open. Inside were papers, dozens of them, letters, church documents, some half-burned, others torn. One stood out, a funeral program for a girl named Annabelle Moore, age 14, listed as a house servant for the Blackwood family. There was no record of her burial, but Mason was staring at it. As he read through the papers, a cold wind rushed past him, even though the trees were still. The flashlight flickered, and then he heard it again. The lullaby, closer this time, humming, delicate, almost loving. He looked up. A small figure stood beneath the tree, her hair in ash-covered braids, her dress torn and smoldering at the edges. Her eyes met his. She wasn't Eliza. She was the other one. And now that he had dug up her name, she wasn't going back into the dark. Chapter 10. The Watchman's Last Shift. Old Gerald Whitaker had worked as the cemetery watchman for nearly 40 years. He wasn't one for ghost stories. He believed in silence, in respect for the dead, and in doing his job without questions. But lately, even Gerald couldn't ignore the unease that had settled over Willow Cemetery like a fog that refused to lift. That night, his shift began like all the others. He brewed his thermos of black coffee, laced up his boots, and walked the familiar gravel paths. The air was colder than usual, and the wind carried with it the faintest smell of smoke. Around midnight, he reached the older section, the part no one visited anymore. That's when he heard it. A girl's voice, humming. He froze. For a moment he thought it was the wind, until the tune grew clearer, sweet, sorrowful, and oddly familiar. Gerald turned toward the sound, flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. The light flickered, and when it steadied, he saw her. A girl, standing beside grave. No. 17. She was barefoot. Her dress singed at the hem, her hair tied back with a ribbon scorched black. Her eyes met his. Not angry, not threatening, just tired. Illy, he whispered. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed first at the ground, then at him. Gerald stepped back, heart pounding. He'd never believed the stories, not until now. He turned to leave, but something sharp dug into his boot. He looked down and saw a rusted key, half buried in the dirt. Attached was a small tag with one word burned into the metal. Tully. That name hadn't crossed his mind in decades. The old chapel, the hidden room beneath the altar. Memories rushed back of locked doors, muffled cries, and secrets buried in stone. Eliza's voice echoed in the wind again. He locked me in. The key shook in Gerald's trembling hand. He understood now. This wasn't just about a ghost. It was about guilt, about complicity, and maybe it was finally time to unlock the past. Because Eliza wasn't just haunting the graveyard, he was asking for justice. Chapter 11. Secrets of the Tombstone. The following afternoon, Mason returned to the cemetery, not to dig, but to decode. Gerald Whittaker's key weighed heavy in his pocket, and even heavier on his conscience. The old man had called him that morning, said he was leaving town, said he couldn't bear the weight anymore. But before he left, he told Mason one more thing. The truth isn't just buried in the ground. It's carved in stone. Mason didn't know what that meant until he saw it. Grave No. 17, Eliza Blackwood's tombstone. It looked just as it always had, simple, elegant, worn by time. But now, Mason looked closer. He ran his fingers along the edges, across the name, the dates. Then he felt something odd near the base. Small raised markings. He got on his knees and brushed away the dirt. The symbols weren't words, not in any language he recognized. They were strange etchings, almost like runes. But they matched what he had seen on the charred locket in the chapel box. Back at home, he flipped through every book he had borrowed until he found one in the folklore section, Protective Burial Rites in Rural America. One chapter detailed secret symbols used by religious sects in the 1960s to trap restless spirits. The markings meant one thing: bound. Eliza hadn't just been buried. She had been trapped, sealed into her grave by ritual, kept silent by design. Mason's hands shook as he scribbled notes. The town hadn't just lied about her death. They'd performed a rite to keep her spirit from ever rising again. Why? That night, Mason returned to the tombstone with a flashlight and a small chisel. He carefully chipped away at the rune, whispering apologies as he worked. As the final mark cracked away, the wind picked up sharply, and the cemetery grew unnaturally cold. A voice echoed behind him, soft, almost relieved. "Thank you." He turned, but no one was there. Yet for the first time, the night felt a little less heavy. But Mason knew it wasn't over. It had only begun. Chapter 12. The Return of Eliza Blackwood. The night after Mason chipped away the final rune from Eliza's tombstone, something changed in the air. It wasn't just colder. It was heavier, like the cemetery had taken a breath and was holding it. Willow Cemetery didn't creak or moan that night. It listened. Mason didn't sleep. He sat by his window, watching the street lamps flicker and sway. Around 2 a.m., he felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, the kind that made his skin prickle. Then came the sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. He peered outside and saw her, Eliza Blackwood. She stood in the center of the street, her scorched dress fluttering in the wind, her face pale and still, eyes locked onto Mason's window. But she wasn't a shadow anymore. She looked almost real. He rushed outside, heart thundering. "Eliza!" he called. She didn't flinch. Instead, she turned and began walking down the road toward the chapel. Mason followed. When he reached the cemetery gates, they were already open. He slipped through and found her standing at the chapel's door, the key to the hidden chamber in her hand. Gerald's key. She looked at him, and for the first time she spoke clearly. "Come see what he buried." The door creaked open, and together they descended into the cold stone corridor beneath the chapel. The air was stale, and the walls were lined with old wooden cabinets, dust-covered relics, and forgotten church files. At the far end of the corridor was a locked metal box, scorched and bolted shut. Eliza pointed to it. "You said I was evil, but it was him." Mason used the key. With a click and a deep metallic groan, the box opened. Inside were records, pages upon pages of handwritten notes from Reverend Tully. Testimonies, threats, and a horrifying truth. Tully had blamed Eliza for the fire, but it was he who had set it. To cover his sins. To silence her. Mason turned to Eliza. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with ash, but for the first time, she smiled. Her story had finally been unearthed. But what would he do with it now? Chapter 13, When the Dead Begin to Speak. Mason didn't return home that night. He sat on the cold stone floor of the chapel's hidden chamber, surrounded by the weight of secrets and ash. The documents in the box, Reverend Tully's twisted confessions, were more horrifying than he could have imagined. But they were also the proof Eliza needed. The truth was no longer buried. And yet, something still lingered. He felt it the moment he stepped out of the chapel and back into the night air. The wind was howling, not through the trees, but through the graves themselves. A chorus of whispers seemed to rise from the earth surrounding him. Eliza. Help. Justice. It wasn't just Eliza anymore. Other voices were joining in, dozens, maybe hundreds. The dead who had been silenced, the ones who had suffered quietly beneath the ground. As Mason walked the cemetery path, lights flickered in the nearby homes. Dogs barked, birds stirred, and windows trembled. Something ancient had awakened. At home, Mason spread the documents across his bedroom floor. He highlighted names, dates, and patterns. He saw how Reverend Tully had used fear to control the town, how he'd silenced not only Eliza, but others who stood against him. Mason couldn't keep this to himself. He emailed scanned pages of the confessions to a local journalist, a woman named Maria Sanchez, who had once written about the town's buried scandals. Then he posted excerpts online anonymously, letting the truth breathe after decades of suffocation. That night, as he tried to rest, the voices returned. But this time, they didn't whisper in fear. They whispered in peace. "Thank you." Mason opened his eyes to find Eliza standing at the foot of his bed. "You heard us," she said softly. "Now they will too." And just like that, she was gone. But the voices, now calm, steady, remained in the air, as if the dead were finally learning how to speak again. Chapter 14. The Curse Beneath the Headstone. The town of Elmridge changed after Mason shared the truth. The story spread like wildfire across social media, through local news, whispered in church halls and behind school lockers. People who had once dismissed the cemetery as just an old patch of land now avoided it like it had teeth. But the story wasn't done. Mason noticed it first. The whispering hadn't stopped. It had only shifted. One afternoon, he returned to grave No. 17 and found something strange. Flowers had been left on Eliza's grave, fresh ones, but Mason hadn't placed them and no one else had ever visited. The petals were deep red and each stem was bound in twine. Nestled beneath them was a stone, small and smooth, with an unfamiliar symbol carved into it. Mason snapped a picture and looked it up. The symbol wasn't for peace. It was a warning. An old sigil, meaning unrest still lingers. That night, he returned to the chapel alone. The hidden chamber remained undisturbed, but as he stepped inside, his flashlight died, plunging him into total darkness. The air grew thick, like the room itself was breathing. Then came the voice, not Eliza's this time. "You opened the gate, but didn't seal it." Mason spun around, trying to make sense of the sound. It echoed from all directions, layered like dozens of voices speaking through one throat. He stumbled backward and felt something brush past his arm, cold and soft, like cloth. He reached into his bag and pulled out the old notebook, flipping to the final page Eliza had written on. There, in the margins, more symbols had appeared, ones Mason hadn't seen before, ones that matched the stone beneath the flowers. Someone or something was trying to communicate again, but this wasn't a cry for help. It was a warning. The ritual that had bound Eliza, it had also bound something else. Something that wasn't meant to wake up. And now, with the runes chipped away and the truth exposed, the curse that had kept it buried was crumbling. Eliza may have found peace, but something else had taken her place. Chapter 15. The night the grave opened again. The night was colder than any Mason could remember. The air was sharp, brittle, as though it might shatter with the slightest sound. And yet, the town was unnaturally quiet. No dogs barked, no cars passed. Even the wind, which had so often carried whispers, now held its breath. Mason stood at the edge of Willow Cemetery, flashlight in one hand, Eliza's notebook in the other. He had read the final pages over and over, tracing the strange new symbols that had appeared on their own. No one had written them, at least, no one living. The warning was clear. Something else had been bound beneath grave No. 17, something old, something dark, and now it was waking. He walked slowly through the cemetery gates. The graveyard no longer felt like just a resting place. It felt alive, as though every stone, every patch of grass was watching him. grave no, 17 was ahead, but it no longer looked sunken. It looked split. The soil had cracked down the center, forming a jagged line. Smoke curled from within, low and gray, and the runes, the ones Mason had chiseled away, had returned, glowing faintly red. Mason knelt, heart hammering. He could hear it beneath the soil. A heartbeat, but not human. It pulsed like the beat of a drum made from bone. Suddenly the ground shook, not violently, but rhythmically, like something knocking from the other side. Mason's flashlight flickered. Then the grave opened, slowly, quietly, deliberate. A skeletal hand emerged, long, burnt, wrapped in the remnants of robes, not clothing. It wasn't Eliza. It was something older. A voice crawled from the pit, not whispered, not spoken, but felt deep in Mason's bones. "You broke the seal, now we remember." Flames flickered in the coffin below, and the shape began to rise. Mason stepped back, breath caught in his throat. He wasn't prepared for this. But then, just as the figure lifted from the grave, another voice rang out, clear, defiant. Eliza. He stood beside him, no longer a ghost, no longer pale. She glowed faintly, like the final spark of a candle refusing to go out. She stepped toward the grave. "You took my life, you won't take his." She raised her hand, and the runes around the grave began to burn white. The skeletal figure screeched, retreating into the earth. The ground roared as the cracks sealed shut, leaving only silence. Eliza turned to Mason, smiling sadly. "You gave me peace, I gave you time." And then, like smoke in wind, she was gone. The grave remained closed. The cemetery fell still. But Mason knew the truth. The grave had opened once, and one day it might open again.